actually have a financial mechanism. Most people would say all of them should have a financial mechanism because how else will developing and transition countries implement their obligations under these treaties? But in fact, only the Stockholm Convention and the Minamata Convention have a financial mechanism. So let's have a little closer look at two of these. I picked the Stockholm Convention and SAICM. The Stockholm Convention has periodically conducted needs assessments, and the most recent one that they conducted in for COP8 compares the needs assessment, and we compared it here with the estimated allocation to the Stockholm Convention from the GEF7 replenishment. And you can see that the need is almost more than 10 times the amount of the estimated GEF7 allocation. And what's serious about this is that this is one of the few international chemicals agreements that actually has a financial mechanism, and it's severely underfunded. The situation in SAICM is also serious. SAICM funding is that narrow slice of the pie, which represents 0.2% of its budget. And ironically, SAICM has an extremely large scope. So what we have is the agreement, which has the broadest scope, has the smallest amount of money. Now, in 2019, this independent evaluation examined 10 years of implementation, and it found some serious items that we need to mention. The first of these is that it made a direct line between the inadequacy of funding and the ability of SAICM to achieve its objectives. And this did not only impact countries trying to implement it, but the funding for the Secretariat was extremely underfunded. And not just a little bit, but for more than half of the time period, it had a huge budget shortfall. And the consequence of this is the most serious one. SAICM was one of its key objectives was to narrow the gap between chemicals management capacities between countries. And so it would not complete that objective if the gap stayed the same. But the gap did not stay the same. It got bigger instead of staying the same. And this is one of the serious consequences of underfinancing the chemicals agenda. Now, so far, what I have been talking about is sort of the why the chemical industry should help participate in the financing of the management of its products. But I'm guessing that you're participating in this webinar because you would like to know how they should do that. And for that, I would like to invite David Azoulay from CL to pick up the presentation from here. David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Joe, for this very good lay of the land. So, as was mentioned before, this is not, the questions we're contemplating now is not completely new. This is something that our community has been trying to deal with for quite some time. And what we came up with as a community is an integrated approach to financing that rests on three main pillars, as seen now: dedicated external financing, industry involvement, mainstreaming in development planning. And the assessment of how the integrated approach works were conducted. And one would assume, given what we've just heard from the first part of the presentation, that industry involvement should actually be much higher than this, because industry is the one both profiting from the main sales of chemicals, as well as the one with probably the deepest pocket and the biggest responsibility in that respect. So this is why we came up with a potential frame on how to address this. And what we were looking at when we developed this proposal was to identify something that would be both effective in raising sufficient amounts of money to address the challenges that we face, as well as something that would be as simple and as easily implementable as possible, because we know that that can be very challenging as well. And so what we came up with is the idea to address the sales, or to levy a potential tax or fee on a small number of chemicals, the basic chemicals. So we're talking about roughly 35 chemicals that are at the basis of the whole production chain of the thousands and tens of thousands of chemicals that we use today. And by doing this, the idea is that you don't have to get exact finger on the pulse for the sales of every chemicals in the world, but only to monitor a small portions of the chemicals that are being sold around the world. And one of the advantage of this, well, before we get there, so how would this work? The idea is that a small, very small percentage would be levied in the small number of countries where basic chemicals are being produced, because this is something we're going to get through later. Basic chemicals are actually being produced in a very small number of countries, which makes the implementation easier. And that the amount collected through this tax or fee would go into a global fund for chemical safety. And the task of this global fund would then be to redistribute it to the governments and stakeholders that are implementing risk reduction measures on the ground, in pursuant to the SAICM agreement, for example, to implement the commitments under SAICM. And as you can see on the slide, the fact that you are a country that hosts basic chemical production facility doesn't mean that you would not have access to the funds that are being collected. Quite the contrary, as a manufacturer, you would probably have some important needs in that respect. And so for those developing or transition countries that host these kinds of facility, there would be a possible access, an easy access to those fundings. Now, one may ask, can a 0.5% actually generate enough money to address the challenges and to fulfill the needs of all the countries? Well, as Joe mentioned earlier, the staggering level of profits that exist makes it that such a very small and almost imperceptible fee or tax of 0.5% would raise $11.5 billion per year, which is orders of magnitude above what is currently being collected, and which is actually a good match to what has been assessed in terms of needs. Now, in terms of implementation, one of the reasons why we focused on basic chemicals, as I mentioned earlier, is that basic chemicals are currently being manufactured in a very small number of countries. You see the main countries appearing on your screen now, and those are relatively outdated figures, but those are the most recent figures that we had access to. It is likely that in the past 10 years since this data was collected, there would be a small number of countries that would be added to this particular list. But what that means is that if this very small number of countries can agree to implement an almost imperceptible fee or tax to the manufacture of a very small number of chemicals, the problem of funding risk management measures and risk reduction measures in the whole world would actually be dealt with finally once and for all. And for those of us who, like me and others, have been part of those discussions for many years and possibly decades, you know that this has been a question that has been one of the major obstacles in developing ambitious measures and true risk reduction, and to actually reduce the impacts of chemicals on health. So let us go back to one thing, because a lot of the discussion that happened the last IP3 and the last open-ended working group revolved around opposing the use of national economic instruments versus global economic instrument. And in fact, a report was prepared by the SAICM Secretariat, but what is the particular advantage? Why are we going for a global mechanism rather than rely on national cost recovery mechanism instead? So the first one is that through national cost recovery mechanism, most of the resources that are collected would be insufficient. And one of the reasons is that the market one of the reasons is that the supply chain is quite international, and there are quite a number of countries who suffer a number of impacts, both health and environmental, from the chemical use or production without actually hosting major production on their territory or activities that would leave itself that will make itself available to provide and to actually to provide some resources around this. If you use this, if you put in place these kinds of mechanism at the global level, the first major advantage is, as we just saw before, with a very minimal, almost imperceptible fee or tax, you actually raise significant revenues, which we haven't been able to do as a community ever, basically. The second question is that one of the main obstacles that we've seen when countries try to develop economic instrument at the national level is that very often it incentivizes industry leaving the country and moving to a neighboring country or to a neighboring region, and using a sort of job types of blackmail or investment blackmail that everyone is very accustomed to in every country because it happens all throughout the world. By moving the instrument at the global level, you create a level playing field. And that is a very important element to avoid industry using loopholes in the legislation or in the framework in certain countries to actually contribute their fair share. And then finally, because the supply chain in chemicals is global, and because the use are very diverse, you can only partly implement polluter pays principle if you use it if you put in place instrument at the national level, because some impacts are transboundary. Because, as was mentioned earlier, the production is concentrated in certain specific areas, while the pollution and the impacts do cross border. And as most of you are familiar with through the work of the Stockholm Convention and others, they can even reach areas where no production or even use of chemicals has been recorded for many, many years. And yes, this is where some of the POPs, for example, will focus and concentrate. And so by implementing these kinds of instruments at the global level, you actually truly implement both the principle and letter of the polluter pays principle. So if we just go quickly at the summary and look at the key elements of the proposal that we've put forward. Such a instrument would actually be profitable. It would provide enough resources to address the needs that have been identified by UNEP and the various secretariat as what is needed. It would allow the internalization of costs that are currently externalized. And so this would also fulfill some of the objectives that have been identified both by the SAICM document as well as the Rio and all of the global international law principle. It would also be a responsible implementation, and actually the implementation of existing framework and mechanism in a way that would deliver a result that has not been delivered so far. This would address one of the major challenges of the chemical and waste cluster, which is its underfunding and challenges both for the secretariats as well as for the countries trying to implement risk reduction and risk management measures. Because it would be a tax that is coordinated, and so would actually require only a small country to implement this, but would deliver a global solution throughout the global supply chain. And as mentioned earlier, it would actually provide sufficient resources and funding to address the needs that have been identified throughout this. So this is the presentation. As mentioned by Joe earlier, there is quite a lot of information and more details available about the proposals at the link that will come up on your screen very shortly. You will have access to the full report, including the list of 35 basic chemicals that we have identified, as well as a short video going through some of the presentation that you've just heard now, as well as a Q&A document that addresses the most commonly heard question that we've had while consulting in preparing that particular proposal. And now I very much look forward to getting into a discussion with you all on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the presenters, Joe and David, for a very interesting presentation showing a possible mechanism for industry involvement, which is, as well as stated simply, is a proposal for coordinated fee on the production value of basic chemicals. These are the chemicals that are used to make other chemicals. Now, I would encourage the participants to ask their questions, and please use the Q&A box for your questions. Maybe we will allow 1 or 2 minutes for the questions to start to appear, and I will be taking them as they come. Thank you. Okay, now I have a first question, and it says, can you list the 35 basic chemicals you propose and those that should be taxed? Thank you. Who is taking this question?
I can take a try at that. Maybe I should have prepared a slide about this, actually. I'm sure that it's interesting to people. The list is actually present in the report. If there is not a huge number of questions, I can find that and share my screen again so you can see it. These include chemicals that you're probably familiar with, benzene, some various gases, and a variety of other sort of very commonly used building block chemicals, feedstock chemicals that are used to make many other substances. So I will turn to try to find that section and share my screen so I can answer you more fully.
Goha, we have actually Malika Emily who's asking the floor. She's put her hand up. Would that be okay if we unmute her to ask her question?
Yeah, please unmute the participants. Thank you.
Okay, Alex, if you could please unmute.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I was also writing my question and comment in the chat, but thank you for giving me the floor. First, I would like to thank Joy and David for their presentations. Well, for those who don't know me, I'm a legal officer at the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention. So I was very interested to hear about your views on the financial mechanisms under these conventions, in particular the Stockholm Convention. Comments and question. I think this proposal is a great idea, technically and financially. My question is, how do we do politically with parties how to put forward this kind of proposal, whether we do it at the COPs, the BRS COPs, or the climate change COP, or both, grouping. I'm sure it would be interesting also for some parties. Some others would oppose, and it's not difficult to, if you look at the list of producers, to know which ones would be more in favor, which ones would be less in favor. So that's my question. How do you think politically we could do to put forward this proposal at the intergovernmental level? And the last comment, it actually makes me think of your proposal, something in between the Tobin tax and the rights to pollute. The first time I heard about the mechanisms on the rights to pollute, it was on a theoretical level. I was still a student, and I was wondering whether it would fly, I mean, politically. And then in the end, in my practice, I ended up in my previous work life, when I was still working in the private sector in law firms, I ended up negotiating contracts in between countries on rights to pollute. So I think these kind of ideas is great also. It reminds me of these kind of original proposals. But the big question is, how do we do it? How do you think we should do it? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question and for the support to this proposal. So what about the political implications? Who is going to take this question? Alex.
Thanks very much. I'll start, and I suspect that I won't be able to cover everything that was mentioned before, so Joe, feel free to jump in whenever. So there are a few questions to address here. First of all, very briefly, your comment on the Tobin tax is interesting, because in preparing this work, we did look at all the existing global fee and tax instrument that existed, and in the annex to the report, you will find a quick description and summary of all these existing instruments, and in comparison, which led us to developing this particular proposal. So I think, yes, this is exactly where we came from. As to the how, I think there are two questions nested in there. The first question is, how do we get the political buy-in? And the second is, what process, where do we use this? How do we get the political buy-in is something that we're all familiar with. This is what international negotiation is about. But it would be interesting to turn the question around and wonder, how do we as a global community accept to be bearing costs that are currently not covered and for which the industry is not participating at this point? And how do we accept, each as individual countries or stakeholders, to impact our public health budget, our all of the budget of the state to subsidize a particular industry? So I think this is where the framing in terms of political buy-in is quite interesting. And we've also already had, in private conversation with some of the countries that are mentioned here, some responses that were quite interested, because it is true even for the countries that are currently listed. If you look at some of the most advanced jurisdiction in the world, such as the EU is currently part of implementing something along those lines to finance ECHA, the European Chemical Agency. And even in those particular countries, in the countries that are most advanced with the most advanced economic instrument, ECHA cannot be self-sufficient if it's just funded on the current existing system. So what we see is there is a need. Countries recognize that there is an appetite, and now the question is, how do we put that in place? And and this is part of the discussion. Obviously, we're putting this idea forward as a resource, but we're not prejudging to answer or to preempt all conversation, negotiation that would happen. Now, the second part of the question is where and in what sort of forum would we use this? It is my sense that given the large scope of SAICM, given the opportunity of what we're currently discussing now, and the essential part of the financial discussions that are taking part in the context of the SAICM Beyond 2020, this would be the primary space in which to start developing such an instrument. It would probably have to be expanded to other fora, whether it's UNEA or the GEF Governing Council, or possibly a COP. All of these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but my sense is that the SAICM process currently gives us the best frame to advance towards the consensus that would be needed to put something like this in place. I'll leave it at that.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. You have, I'm very glad that you have sort of looked at this proposal and thought about the BRS conventions as being also quite relevant to it. In the case of the Stockholm Convention, you know, there is an obligation for parties that have an assessment system to prevent the synthesis or production of new POPs and to actually deal with the ones that are currently on the market. But over the history of the Stockholm Convention, there's usually a very small number of countries that are making substances that contaminate the entire world. So there is quite a bit of relevance of this topic to the convention. With regards to how do we do it, well, we prepared what we call a thought starter paper. So we're hoping to rely on the experienced hands in the audience for this. I can share my screen briefly to so you can see the list of these countries once again. So here they are. You know, this is data, fairly old data, well, 10 years from UNIDO. And it might be interesting to know if UNIDO has any update to this data. Perhaps one place to start would be some consultation with these countries. I don't know if any of the representatives of these countries are on this webinar, but eventually they will hear about this. And sort of awareness of the proposal would be a good place to start. And then to just go back briefly to the previous question about the basic chemicals. So here is a list that we have in our report. This could be up for discussion, but these are chemicals used to make many other substances. And the logic of the proposal is to apply the fee to the production value of the manufacture of these chemicals. So neither of us have provided the magic bullet, but we're very happy and all ears about any other suggestions for how to actually implement this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. If no one wants to add to this answer, we have another interesting question that is directly linked to the previous one, and it is, what has been the feedback of the chemical industry to the proposed financial mechanism? And another question which is also linked to that, did you discuss with relevant industry? So the question is about industries. What has been the feedback of the chemical industry to the proposed financial mechanism, and did you discuss with any relevant industry? Thank you. Who is going to take?
Okay, I'll take a try at that one. We did not check with the industry first before making this proposal, but we have been talking about this idea within SAICM since the second preparatory meeting of SAICM in 2004. I know that because IPEN actually proposed this at that meeting, which was held in Nairobi, Kenya. And since then, I think our industry colleagues are quite tired of hearing me and others make this proposal. But the time has really come to address actually operationalizing the industry involvement part of the integrated approach. UNEP did an evaluation of this approach, which I'm sure many of you have seen, and it really found no evidence for any operationalizing of this part of the integrated approach, and that needs to happen. There was a brief press article in the trade press in Chemical Watch, is one of the trade press publications. I was just looking for it as I heard the question, but I don't have it at my fingertips. But I'm not clear whether colleagues from the industry have examined the proposal in a detailed way or have specific comments about it. In that article, the comments appeared to be more general. If there are colleagues on the call, we're happy to hear their comments during this question and answer period. But I think it would be interesting for them to perhaps provide some information that they might have about where basic chemicals are manufactured. Thank you.
Thank you. It seems that we're discussing quite complicated things. And the next question is really very interesting, as it speaks about communication language from Gilbert. Can simple communication language, like the whole of the proposition, to get manufacturer of the base chemicals to pay 5% of 100 USD, for instance, for SAICM, can it help in political uptaking? How to communicate? That's the question.
Gohar, there's also, before this question was a raised hand from Celia. She's been unmuted, so if you don't mind, we can give her the floor to ask the question, and then we can come back to this. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Cilla Magyar with ICCA, and we have met before in the SAICM discussion, Joe and David, also in UNEA. So thank you for your presentation. Maybe some questions, and also, Joe, you suggested that maybe we could make an, comment as industry. I think as an industry, we have been commenting that, yes, we recognize the need for better financing of the SAICM instrument. That would certainly also include the secretariat and other things. I think we are very supportive of, the integrated approach to financing, where industry has its role, and one of the key roles that we see is the capacity building efforts, and we have come forward with proposals for a capacity building clearinghouse and mechanism to have a much more efficient and effective approach to ensure that especially developing countries and countries in transition would be able to build up basic chemical management in these countries and also have the financing to do that. And so in generally, we do support a fee-based chemicals management systems also in these developing countries, and have been or are trying to contribute towards those efforts through our toolbox, the regulatory toolbox, through workshops. But there are also other countries, like I know that Sweden, the Swedish agency CHEMI, for example, also has like a toolbox on how a developing country could build up a fees-based system. And so that is certainly one way to do that. I mean, we have been opposing a blanket financial fund, as you know, but there are many other ways. So one of my questions to you was also, I mean, first on is building a fee-based chemicals management system at the national level not also an option in your view? Second, access to CHEF funding has been limited. And so, what would be a way to also increase the priority of CHEF funds towards, building chemicals management systems in those countries? And the third question is, I think, I'm representing ICCA, so the chemicals industry, but if I look at your figures, you're clearly also including pharma sales and what have you in this, and I'm not sure if they have been to the table at all. So I was wondering if that's been part of your discussions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sila. Interesting viewpoint from the industry sector. And who is going to take this? David? No?
I can give it a try, and
Okay,
David,
Joe.
if he's able, can also jump in, or also Nathaniel. Thank you very much for your points and your comments. I'll take the last one first on the pharmaceutical, the inclusion of pharmaceutical sales. We did include that in the sales slide, but in the actual calculation slide, we stuck to the value, the specific value of basic chemicals production, so that the pharmaceuticals were not included in that figure. That's why it's less. With regards to a national option, we discussed this a little bit in the presentation, and we have a little bit more detail in the report. One of the disadvantages of a national option is if you really have no significant industry in your country, then there's no one to tax. And it's difficult to raise enough money to deal with your needs. And so one of the advantages of a global system is that it's more of a level playing field, which has some attraction to the industry, I think, and also provides the ability for countries, which are many, that do not have significant industries but have significant needs. About the GEF financing, it's difficult to sort of get into the competition for GEF funds, which have over many years prioritized biodiversity and climate as their primary investments. And there's no doubt that both of those topics are extremely important and worthy of financing. The other issue and problem with GEF access, though it's very appealing for governments to have a one-stop place to provide money, one of the difficulties from the national end is that, well, the rules often change, but the requirement for co-finance and the sort of categories of the projects mean that it's often very difficult to get smaller amounts of money to implement very worthy activities. And this was one of the reasons why the Quick Start program was so popular. It was widely ridiculed when it came out, actually, and soon became the most popular thing around because the bureaucracy was low, no co-finance was required, and the maximum was 250,000, but many participants, many governments picked lower amounts, and they did quite a bit with those lower amounts of money, which illustrated the utility of it. So I'll stop there so others can comment and ask questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. If there are no other additions to this answer, then maybe we can move to the question about the communication language. And the question is about how to take the helping in political upscaling, how to talk to the industry and to the base chemicals to pay, for instance, 5 cents of each of 100 USD for the SAICM. That's a question from Gilbert. Thank you. Who will take it?
I'll jump in quickly. First, I just want to clarify, it would be 50 cents for each 100 US dollars under the current proposal. But yes, we absolutely agree that presenting what can be a quite technical proposal, but in more simple terms, is an effective part of building political willpower for it. That end, it's worth noting that this has been on the minds of delegates in the past as well. The very simple idea that as Joe and David have already spoken on, doesn't really make sense for even donor country governments to be the ones bearing the primary burden of funding capacity building in developing and transition countries. A former EU delegate was quoted as saying that she just was unable to explain to colleagues why we as aid donors are propping up and making sure chemicals and wastes are handled properly when there is such a profitable industry behind some of these costs. So these are the very simple ideas at the heart of this proposal. And thank you for this question.
Thank you, Nathaniel. I don't see any questions in Q&A. Maybe there are questions from the participants who have raised hands. I don't see those. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no more raised hands, at least.
Just something brief. There's no reason to prolong this session longer than it needs to be. I'm not discouraging anyone from asking the questions you want to ask, but we wanted to try to do a little bit different style webinar. I kind of hate to say the word. It's the new word of 2020. But so we wanted to do a brief presentation, have about the same amount of time for questions and comments, and then allow people to get on with their busy days. So if you have questions and comments, we're very pleased to hear them and try to answer them. If not, we do not need to prolong this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Now I think we can, I don't see any more questions, and we are always welcome to send questions by email to Joe. I think he will be happy to answer, or anyone who was on the panel. So I would like to thank everyone. As I will switch on the videos. I would like to thank everyone again for your joining our technical briefing, for active participation, for your questions, for your support. And I also would like to ask SAICM, thanks Secretariat for hosting. So thank you very much, and we hope that that proposal will fly, and I'm sure that you have gained lots of insights to enrich your thought starter. Thank you.
And just to add, Goha, we have another session this afternoon. So if colleagues feel like they would also like to participate in that, you're most welcome to. It will be at 3 o'clock Geneva time, Central European time.
Yeah,
so
thank you, Nalini.
Have a lovely day, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.